Thank you very much indeed. One of my roles at Oxford is to run their continuing education, which includes part-time degrees, summer schools, but also online courses, completely online courses where people can take them from anywhere in the world. And they include a growing number of 10-week online courses on political economy, which take very much the same approach as this forum and this network. So I'm very pleased indeed to be invited and very keen to collaborate further in the future. Now, Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister, at one of his conference speeches complained, "People say we have to debate globalization. You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer." And I don't want to shock anyone this early in my presentation, but in my view, Tony Blair was completely wrong on that score. Globalization isn't a predetermined thing which just automatically comes along like autumn after summer. It's something, firstly, which is created by governments, institutions, politicians like Tony Blair, and also, therefore, which had varied considerably over the past. So I'm going to argue that it's not a question of whether globalization is good or bad or right or wrong. The question is what form of globalization, hence the title, what form of globalization should we be creating? And I'm going to argue that we should move from the capitalism unleashed form of globalization that we've been suffering under for the past 30 years or so, which caused the global financial crisis and subsequent international recession, towards a new era for the next 30 or 40 years, which I characterize here as being around a global Green New Deal to ensure it's an era of sustainability. Now, I can keep this presentation very brief, I'm pleased to say, because it's all outlined in a very short book, which I was pleased to say is on sale outside at a specially reduced conference rate of only £10. So provided everyone promises to read that, I'll go straight to the conclusion. We can move to pre-dinner drinks. But in the book, I really do two things. One is say that we need a new approach to economics, very much along the lines that this forum and network is pursuing, and I'll say one or two things about that at the end. But also that globalization isn't new. And when I say that, I always think it's well illustrated by a joke I must have heard decades ago about a Native American who goes to a Native American conference in New York, and the conference dinner is in Native American costume. So he's dressed up, he goes to the reception desk to ask where the dining hall is, he's pointed to it, and the person behind reception says, "Is this your first time in New York?" And the Native American says, "Yes, it is." And the person behind the reception desk says, "Well, what do you think of our city?" And the Native American says, "It's fine. What do you think of our country?" Because, of course, there's been massive movement of people, globalization of people well over 100 years ago, in that case from Europe to North America, huge movements of trade, huge movements of capital, and so on. So the question is, what form? And the second thing that the book argues in terms of globalization is that the current form, the form that the late Oxford economist Andrew Glynn termed capitalism unleashed in his book of that title, the deregulated, privatized, greed is good, no such thing as society. Some of you know greed is good is from the film Wall Street. No such thing as society was Margaret Thatcher's famous view. That's an inadequate, indeed damaging form of globalization, which led to the 2007-2008 international financial crisis. This is a photo from 2007, which went all around the world for a purpose. It was quite a significant photo. Britain managed to reinvent something, namely the bank run. Those of you who did economics at school will remember being taught that when banks first founded, people were always a bit suspicious about whether they really had their money saved there or whether perhaps they'd lent it out to somebody else. And so whenever this suspicion got a bit too high, they'd race back to the bank to get their money out, and when everyone else saw that happen, they would go there too, and sure enough, the bank would run out of money and it would collapse. And that's why bank regulation had to be introduced to try to reassure people, create trust in the population that there would be sufficient funds. However, because of the excesses of the deregulated financial boom under this form of capitalism leading up to 2007, the people up here in Newcastle didn't believe that the bank would have the money despite the regulation. Understandably, because regulation had been to great degrees reduced. And sure enough, in the morning when the doors opened, it turned out they didn't have any money, and they didn't get their money back, and the bank collapsed. The other interesting thing about this photo, though, is Northern Rock had been, before it became a private shareholder-owned bank, it had been for generations a very successful financial institution, a member-owned organisation, which in Britain are called building societies, mutuals, that's entirely owned by their members rather than shareholders on a one person, one member, one vote principle. And these financial institutions had arisen around the time of development of capitalism in Britain. So pretty well every town and city had their own mutual member-owned building society where local people saved, and then when they wanted to buy a house, they borrowed from the building society and then paid back their mortgage over 30 years or so. And part of the greed is good, capitalism unleashed era of globalisation, which was driven by Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s, and then continued subsequently by Tony Blair and Clinton and others, as well as privatisation, deregulation, financialisation. It also in Britain involved demutualisation, so that these companies were sold off to become shareholder-owned banks. And of course, the accumulated wealth over previous generations was then gorged by the current members and very much the boards and financial advisors who were advising that this would all be good for the customers. It would mean the companies would innovate, move forward, and the customers, members of the community would be the ones who benefited. And a huge proportion of that mortgage market moved into private banks as these institutions were demutualised. And despite those claims, some of you already know this, and the others who don't may not be totally surprised, despite these claims that they've been much more successful as private banks, the number of them, not only who were more successful, but the number of them who even survived as independent private banks was zero. They were all taken over by bigger banks or collapsed like Northern Rock. So the immediate response, obviously the financial crisis, was bailing out the banks, spending internationally to try and prevent the financial crisis creating a huge global depression like the Great Depression in the 1930s, and to an extent succeeded. So 2009, although it was the first technical recession since the 1930s, despite continued growth in India and China, the total income and output of the world, it did fall, but nevertheless it stopped it being worse. And there were pledges to action so that it wouldn't happen again, to rein back, put the leash back on capitalism to some extent, if you like. Variously, banking reform, rebalancing the economy from the bloated financial sector back to more manufacturing, promoted more diversity, in Britain explicitly re-establishing mutuals, ensuring regional balance, which had become very imbalanced in a lot of countries as a result of this globalisation. So both macroeconomic and microeconomic policies. And for anyone watching on live stream who's not an economist and doesn't know the jargon, I have heard the terms defined like this, that microeconomists are wrong about specific things, whereas macroeconomists are just wrong in general. Now, the problem is that as soon as the world economy had been stopped from falling into deep recession, orthodoxy came back, and we've had austerity, which has blocked recovery in most countries over the last 10 years. And almost all those pledges for reform were reneged on. Very few of them have been seen through. So in many ways, the global economy is just as fragile now as it was leading up to the global financial crisis. The problem hasn't been fixed. One example, in Britain, this promoting greater corporate diversity, the government, coalition government elected in 2010, so 5 years, Conservative alliance with Liberal Democrats, had a coalition agreement in which they acknowledged that one of the causes of the financial crisis was this move to these too big to fail shareholder-owned banks, and not only should be rebalancing back to manufacturing, but the financial services sector should have more corporate diversity with more mutuals in them again. But although they pledged that is something the government would do, they didn't introduce any measures to measure what would happen. So there'd be no way of knowing whether they were succeeding or failing. So with a colleague, we created an index for that. And this link here, and I'm told all these PowerPoints will be on the conference website, so anyone can get them there and go through to the link. We created which comes to the paper, which explains in detail how we constructed the index and so forth, and then also tracked it over time. And upwards is good and downwards is bad in terms of the degree of diversity. So you can see that the degree of corporate diversity was deteriorating before the financial crisis, and arguably was one of the causal factors behind it. Not surprisingly, the financial crisis itself actually made matters worse, but subsequently there was no progress made at all by the government in furthering their pledge. And similarly, on the regional problem of regional inequality that had been created by this form of capitalism unleashed. This is just taken from The Economist recently, and it shows both the degree of regional inequality between the poorest region, this is GDP per head, and the richest region, which are the the higher numbers for each country, and also what's happened over time. The lower one. So you can see in Sweden, not much inequality and no sort of deterioration. But you can see France, the United States, Germany, and particularly Britain, things have got a lot worse. Firstly, they were the most unequal countries beforehand, and secondly, a big increase in inequality. And I should say that in terms of Britain, things are way, way worse than that chart shows, because there's actually a break in the chart. It stops at 400, but you have to go to 1,150. So that would be out over into the next lecture theatre over there. And this is after the government pledged to tackle the problem of inequality. And I think in terms of the vote for Brexit in Britain and the vote for Trump in the democratic heartlands of the Rust Belt states, the old manufacturing states, which switched from Democrat to Republican, this is may have some relevance, because at the time of the Brexit vote, it was said, and in the campaign, it was said that things are improving, the economy's recovering, things are better now than before the crisis. And so after the vote, when it was reported that it was just an expression of anger, people were just angry at the government and their poverty and the impact of the previous recession and the failure to recover, there was a bit of a puzzle there. And interestingly, it was the chief economist at the Bank of England, who's actually a very broad-minded, good economist in my view, Andy Haldane, said, well, let's look at the figures. So we looked at the figures on a national level, which showed that everyone in Britain had become richer, and all the, but then he looked at it on a regional basis, and actually that recovery, that increase in GDP per head, was true for only two regions in Britain. I won't waste time by asking for guesses, but one was London, and the other was the southeast, which is the area around London. And every other region in Britain, it was untrue. So like I say, that may be a bit of a hint about Brexit, especially since just telling people that they have got better when they're not, and that London has got super better, doesn't necessarily make them happier. So I think this cartoon sums it up. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment of time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Because unfortunately, we are still stuck in this shareholder value world where that drives corporate behaviour. You know that Jack Welch, the American industrialist, really promoted this idea of shareholder value. That the point of boards of directors, managers, was to deliver value to shareholders rather than to customers or employees or suppliers of the local community. I mean, to be fair to him, after the financial crisis, he did say that shareholder value was probably the dumbest idea in the world, and yet we're still living under it. So I would argue, and do it in this book, which has also just come out, on alternative corporate models, that we certainly need to get past that mania about shareholder value just maximising short-term profits for higher dividend payments to raise shareholder price and therefore the bonuses of the people running the companies. And one part of that could be an expansion of cooperatives, employer-owned companies, member-owned mutuals around the world. And this book has got contributions from dozens of authors from all over the world, analysing different corporate forms and experiments, developments across the world. So, to conclude, I would say we need two things at the macro and micro level. In terms of globalisation, the key point is that globalisation should be for a purpose. It is the form of globalisation is decided by governments, institutions, opposed by us, the electorate, the citizens, and there have been better forms of globalisation in the past, and there could be again in the future. We need a form of globalisation which would be actively promoting at local, regional, national and international global levels environmental and social sustainability. And I think one thing which would contribute positively towards that at the micro, the corporate level, would be to have companies with focused not on their shareholder value, but on their corporate purpose, with actually delivering the goods and services that they're supposed to be doing, and with appropriate corporate ownership and governance models for whatever purpose they're pursuing. Some that might be private ownership or shareholder ownership, but for many it's much more appropriate to have member ownership, which are often not only better as organisations, but also provide greater corporate diversity, which makes regions and economies more resilient when problems and shocks do come along. But also, it has been shown convincingly that the existence and the behaviour of those alternative forms does restrain the shareholder-owned firms from pursuing just shareholder value. They do have to pay some attention to their customers and local communities as well. Now, finally, I started off with a quote from Tony Blair, so I was wondering, which sets the bar pretty high. So I was wondering who I could quote to conclude. And I couldn't think of anyone until it struck me the Queen of England would be appropriate, particularly since in 2008, the London School of Economics invited her along to show off their wonderful economics research. And she looked at it, the board showing it off, and said, yes, but why didn't you predict the financial crisis? So they thanked her for her visit and sent her back to Buckingham Palace. About 3 weeks later, about 3 weeks later, they managed to come up with an answer and sent her a letter, which went on for 3 pages, ending up, in summary, Your Majesty, the failure to foresee the crisis was a failure of the collective imagination of many bright people. I think they were referring to themselves, of many bright people to understand the risks to the system as a whole. Now, those of you old enough to have seen the British comedy programme in the 60s, Monty Python's Flying Circus, will no doubt think, well, that's a statement of the bleeding obvious. But also, you might think, well, they can talk for themselves. Because what they didn't admit to the Queen was that the economics profession community has got very diverse views, and many of them did predict and did warn about it. The problem is that these bright people who had this failure of collective imagination would only appoint to the London School of Economics other economists who also suffered from that failure of collective imagination. So it's absolutely vital that we do have a broad-minded approach to economics, that we don't just rely on these people who had this collective failure of imagination. So for that reason, again, I'm particularly pleased to have been invited along, and I would just encourage everyone to not have that failure of imagination, stick to our guns, that the economic analysis and economic policy should fit the reality of the world. I'm sure you've heard the definition of an economist being someone who sees something working in practice but wonders whether it would work in theory. And the corollary of that is the problem with so much economic policy is it works very well in theory, but not enough attention is paid to the reality of the societies and economies in which it's being introduced, a point made earlier, so it can do so much damage. And just one final example is the welfare result economists come up with, which is provided policies enhance income overall, then so long as the winners compensate the losers, because usually with change there'll be losers as well as winners, then everyone can be better off. The danger is when policy is then introduced on that basis, and lo and behold, the winners, who tend to be the people who are the richest, wealthiest and most powerful in the first place anyway, for some reason forget to compensate the losers. And again, I think that's when you get votes like Brexit and Trump. Thank you very much.